أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين بسم الله يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر وربك فكبر وثيابك فطهر والرجز فاهجر ولا تمنن تستكثر ولربك فاصبر صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين. I bear witness that nothing deserves to be worshipped except Almighty Allah, the one true God. And I testify that Muhammad, upon whom be peace, is his servant, messenger, and the last of the prophets. And I begin in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. My dear sisters and brothers all, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I would have recited to you the first 7 verses of chapter 74 of the Holy Quran, a chapter that is entitled Al-Muddathir. And the English translation is as follows. O you who wrap thyself up, arise and warn, and thy Lord do magnify, and thy garments do purify, and uncleanness do shun, and do no favour seeking gain, and for the sake of thy Lord be patient. After a long period of utter darkness that enveloped the world, the Holy Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, was given those verses that charter by Almighty Allah. Shortly after the first revelation of the first 5 verses of chapter 96, he repaired to his home and he asked his wife Khadija to cover him and to wrap himself up. And this is why this chapter is called that. Allah addresses him as the one who is covered in a mantle. And it eventually became one of his beloved, endearing nicknames. But the title means much more than that, because it is there to remind all followers of the Holy Prophet that Allah does not select leaders necessarily from royal lineage. A very common person can in fact receive divine revelation. So my aim today is to really focus on those few verses. The second verse is the epitome of the life and breath of Islam. In 2 words, the secret of the future glory of Islam was given. The key to the advancement of the Muslim nations was Qum fa'anthir, arise and warn. It was their motto. It was the cry that took them forward and imbued them with the spirit with which they conquered the hearts and minds of a large section of the known world. In the 7th century, Islam became a religion of action, not of dreams. Our Holy Prophet obeyed the heavenly command, and as long as his people followed in his footsteps, they led the whole world. Almighty Allah has given a Muslim life and vigor not to be spent in indolence, not in seclusion, not in a monastery, but on the intellectual and moral and spiritual battlefields of the world to assert to assert such light and truth that will forever stimulate man's intellectual and reasoning faculties. Kum fa'anzir, arise and warn, was the watchword of our beloved Prophet. It was the clarion call that reverberated across the Arabian desert and soon reached the shores of Europe and North Africa. It was the driving force behind the rapid spread of Islam. It ignited the hearts of a dedicated band of Muslims for one purpose only, and that was to obey the command, and thy Lord do magnify. The Muslims saw in their leader and guide, the noble Prophet, no selfish motives, no personal glories accompanying this noble quest. They soon learned that to magnify their Lord did not mean chanting praises of his name, but to put to good work their hidden faculties that were vouchsafed to them by Almighty Allah. They came to understand that Almighty Allah gave man the mental and spiritual capacities to rise to great heights and gain control and rule the world. That we were given intelligence to gain control and harness the forces of nature, the sun, the moon, the wind, the sea. And we were endowed with moral and spiritual attributes, which when developed properly, it drove us as human beings to a selfless zeal to improve the condition of all humankind. So that the early Muslims, they saw these noble qualities in the Holy Prophet Muhammad, and they followed suit and soon bore witness to the fact that it was only through the application of these noble attributes and the good that flow from it that man was able to magnify his Creator. So in a sense, they would have obeyed that command to, and thy Lord do magnify. So in that sense, they became the true vicegerents of Almighty Allah on earth, in the truest sense of the word. So that there are certain preconditions that you have to fulfill, and the passage of the Quran that I would have read does in fact give us those preconditions. The next verse, وَالْرُجْزَ فَخْجُرْ, in that man is asked to shun every abomination, everything low and sordid, that we are commanded to be mentally and morally above that, to be straight in all our dealings, and to be free from dishonesty, deceit, hypocrisy, duplicity, and to be bold and upright in all our actions. At the same time, man is commanded to observe the golden rule of avoiding all forms of corruption and bribery. So we come now to the next command. وَلَا تَمْنُنْ تَسْتَكْثِرْ, and do no favor-seeking gain. My dear sisters and brothers, if only all leaders, whether religious or political, could put this one golden rule to the test and apply it in their lives, this world would certainly be a better place to live in. The Holy Quran teaches that only through the total avoidance of all these vices that have repeatedly led to the ruin of large empires, temporal and religious, a solid foundation for the preservation and stability of societies across the world will be laid. And thus, man will be able to magnify his Lord through peaceful, harmonious governance and deal responsibly with the assets placed in his charge by his Lord, the Creator, Nourisher, and Sustainer of all the worlds. And by so doing, we will establish a heavenly situation on earth. This indeed existed in the time of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, and it continued with his righteous caliphs. And only after that, corruption slowly set in. But we had the template available to us. When we look at the current situation, 1400 years later, we find that our world is again steeped in a state of spiritual darkness, much like the pre-Islamic era. Even though that we have now gained control over the forces of nature and we are in a very technologically advanced stage, our prowess has not made us any more devoted to Almighty Allah, but rather it has made us arrogant and morally and spiritually bankrupt. We think that we own the world. We have lust for material power and pelf, and it is threatening to reach ominous proportions. But inside this global picture of spiritual gloom, we have the message of the Holy Quran. And this is how we will find ourselves. This is how we will find our way out of it. The problem is that we have Muslims who are themselves entangled in self-destructive ideological practices. There is so much confusion that prevails, and they do not know which way to turn. They always ask to or refer their issues to the religious leaders, the scholars, and whoever else, and they are looking for all sorts of guidance besides what is contained in the Holy Quran. And these leaders, they offer them as much as they maybe they have a good intention. They're lured into a trap of false security. And then you have an ultra-radical version of Islam that sets in. But, my dear sisters and brothers, we must recognize that all is not lost. Before his departure from this earth, the Holy Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, made a promise to the Muslims that a Messiah will appear in the latter days among them, much like the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, appeared among the Jews. He gave us the assurance that with himself at the vanguard of the divinely ordained universal peace mission, and with the Messiah at the end, his community will never go astray. Unfortunately, the majority of Muslims did not understand these prophecies related to the latter-day Messiah, and many, to their peril, still do not even today. Misguided theologians from among them entirely misled the community by giving literal interpretations to prophecies, couched in metaphor and common errors made by theologians over the ages. They adopted a literal approach to these hadith, and they did not understand the whole question of the Messiah that was promised. And just like the Jews would have rejected Jesus, we have a situation where that prophecy of the Holy Prophet Muhammad was in fact rejected by the majority of Muslims. But just a little reflection on the matter immediately tells us that the expectation of a bloodthirsty Messiah is a complete contradiction of the teachings of our beloved Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, whom Almighty Allah gloriously posted at the head of this universal peace movement called Islam, so that all expectations of even a reasonably sane person would be that the teachings of the one prophesied to come at the end of this divinely ordained spiritual cycle should be the same and not in conflict with that of the Holy Prophet. That would be the most significant criterion by which to judge whether the person to come in the latter days to ensure that the Muslims do not stray from the straight path is indeed true and not an impostor. So, in this generation of darkness, which started at the beginning of the 14th century Hijrah, the strains of Qum fa anthir, arise and warn, was once again heard This time from a distant corner of the earth in a small village in northern India called Qadian, by one whose very name, Ghulam Ahmad, means a servant of Ahmad. He pronounced on the top of his voice that according to the Holy Quran and authentic traditions of our Holy Prophet, that the Prophet Jesus was deceased and that there was no such thing as a bloodthirsty militant Messiah to appear. He said that he is the Messiah that was promised to the Muslims and that he comes in peace in a similar kind of spirit as that of the Prophet Jesus, alayhi salam, and that by means of arguments and by rational discussion with the pen and oral arguments, that he will provide proofs of the Holy Quran and the previous scriptures without force or coercion that will establish the truth of Islam forever. He immersed himself in the being of our Holy Prophet Muhammad, so much so that his righteousness beamed forth like the noonday sun and restored faith amongst his followers in much the same manner that the Holy Prophet Muhammad did at the beginning of the grand reformist cycle of humanity. He claimed that Allah had raised him up as the Mujaddid, the reformer of the faith, in the age in accordance with the prophecy of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, and invited all Muslims to set aside their petty differences and take the beautiful message of Islam to the world. His clarion call was also, Kum fa'anthir, arise and warn, that he formed a dedicated fraternity of pious followers who pledged to assist him in the noble task of spreading the true light and learning of Islam and hold it above all the religions of the world. He championed the reformist movement by calling the Muslim fraternity back to the Holy Quran. By means of solid arguments from the pages of the Quran, he corrected the erroneous interpretations that had crept into the teachings of Islam centuries after the Holy Prophet Muhammad had already gone. That he stood in defense of Islam against non-Muslims and the clerics at the time in his region. He spearheaded the fight against irreligion and atheism, and this is well documented by all of his books and writings and articles and speeches. And any fair-minded thinker who would read this would understand that he did so much to prevent the Muslim community from going astray in the latter days. But as is the fate of all righteous servants of Allah, he was, of course, rejected by the majority, and his teachings were largely ignored, with the result that many Muslims have gone astray with the horrific consequences that we see today. Without the teachings of the Messiah to guide them, we have seen how the majority of Muslims from several countries in the world find themselves trapped in an ideological maze that leads to nowhere except to bloody sectarian conflict and ultimately to a complete loss of faith. Their worldly empires are crumbling as well. They are plagued by rebellion and anarchy, and the situation has led to a refugee crisis that even this country is experiencing quite in shocking proportions. Many Muslims are preparing to Christian-ruled Europe for safer havens. If the Muslim world was so perfect, why are they finding ways to get out of there? So we have to recognize that it calls to mind one of the prophecies related to the Messiah Jesus, son of Mary, which, when he received the night before the crucifixion, as recorded in Matthew 26, verse 31, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad. Up until today, Muslim leaders and theologians do not know how to solve the problem that has now become completely out of control. At most, what we hear are hypocritical outbursts that such acts have nothing to do with Islam, but then they preach that the same twisted ideologies from their pulpits. Yet it was Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Sahib who told them what to do. They had to print articles and magazines stating the correct teachings of Islam, redefine jihad, disseminated widely amongst the ignorant masses. In reality, this is what the pledge is all about, and that is to form a united fraternity with the Messiah to combat these erroneous teachings that have crept into Islam. This is what Kum fa Anthir is all about. Arise and warn, all over again. It is so vitally important in these latter days of the Messiah. There is no doubt that there will be saintly people, even today, and eloquent scholars that attract our admiration. But the mission of the Messiah is a special, divinely ordained mission, which none other than the Holy Prophet himself warned will need the support and attention of all Muslims in the latter day. He pointed to the Messiah as the only one that will save Muslims from the deadly ideological vortex that threatens to drown them by throwing them a spiritual lifeline and urging them to embark on his arc of light and guidance and stability. My dear sisters and brothers, the command of Kum fa Anthir is not one that emanated from the Holy Prophet, and it is not one that emanated from the Messiah. It came from Allah himself. So obedience to the Holy Prophet and the Messiah, to heed the call of Kum fa Anthir, is to show obedience to Almighty Allah, who we are answerable to in the end. May Almighty Allah inspire us, guide us, and protect us as we embark on this noble journey, and help us to weather the obstacles and challenges that we come across with perseverance and patience in obedience to His command. But we have to recognize that we have to be, and we did, the final verse says, Wali Rabbika Fasbir, and for the sake of thy Lord, be patient. Barakallahu lana wa lakum fil Qur'an al-Azim, wa nafana wa iyayakum bil ayati wa zikr al-Hakim. Innahu ta'ala jawadun karim, malikun barur, raufur rahim. May Allah bless us all in the glorious Quran, and may He let us benefit by the signs and the wise remembrance. Verily Allah the Almighty is affectionate, King, benign, compassionate, and merciful.